آمن ولا في حاجة. الاحتلال جاي قد ما يقدر يقتل في الشعب الفلسطيني، ما في آمن وكله كذب. وإحنا الله وقعنا مع واحد مجرم حرب اسمه نتنياهو، زلمة قاتل أوسخ من النازية. إيش اللي هذا بصير أطفال ينقتلوا بالطريقة هذه تلم لحمهم فتافيت.
Rafah is where Gazans have fled to after several rounds of evacuations, driving them from north to south. It is also the entry point for much-needed relief supplies for Gazans. At this point, Gazans have only one question in mind: where to go now?
احنا اذا دخلوا رفح ولا ما دخلوا رفح ملزمين على سلامتنا، يعني نطلع نتوجه على اي مكان امن بيقولوا لنا اياه، رغم انه احنا مقتنعين قناعه تامه انه هدول لا في مكان امن ولا حاجه. والدليل على ذلك ما شاهدناه في الشمال وفي خان يونس وفي الوسط. بقول لك امن وفي الطريق بقعد يقصف فيه. فيش مكان امن ما دام في حكومه زي هذه، حكومه نازيه، فيش مكان امن.
Israel says Rafah has become the bastion of Hamas militants. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered his troops to prepare to charge into the city. Plans are being drawn for evacuating civilians from Rafah. This is after the wartime leader rejected Hamas's proposal and insisted on achieving total victory on the militant group.
והערב באתי להגיד לכם דבר אחד: אנחנו בדרך לניצחון מוחלט. הניצחון הוא בהישג יד. זה לא עניין של שנים או עשרות שנים, זה עניין של חודשים.
The conditions are already miserable here. There's panic and fear on the ground.
العملية البرية جاية وحيأخذوا وفزعوا في رفح زي ما فزعوا في الشمال وعملوا كلها مجازر. فوق 1000 مجزرة صارت والعالم مش متحرك ساكت. واخدين ضوء اخضر يعملوا مجازر وحياخذوا رفح وسووا لهم اياه، ما حدش حيقول لهم ايش بتساوي. يعني احنا ضحية العالم كله، والعالم لليوم ما صحيش ينصفنا ويعطينا حدود.
Netanyahu's decision has drawn condemnation from Western leaders. Washington says it will not back Israel's Rafah offensive, while adding that the step could be a disaster. United Nations chief says the operation could exponentially increase the humanitarian nightmare unfolding in Gaza. Saudi Arabia has also warned of a humanitarian catastrophe. Day by day, pressure is mounting on the Israeli Prime Minister, but he remains adamant, and his stance is seemingly hurting Israel. Ratings agency Moody's downgraded the country's credit rating. This is for the first time Israel has to face the ignominy. Clearly, the mood seems to be changing against Israel. But will the Israeli Prime Minister change his strategy? Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
And our top focus in WION right now. Ahead of a looming ground offensive in the southern Gaza city of Rafah, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu directed his military to prepare to evacuate an estimated 1.3 million people in the city. This comes as Israel is continuing with its offensive in the Gaza Strip. Israeli airstrikes have killed 17 people in Rafah on the Gaza border overnight. At least 117 people have been killed and more than 150 injured in the last 24 hours in Gaza. The Health Ministry in Gaza reports that the total death toll from the Israeli offensive now stands at over 28,000 and almost 68,000 people have been injured. This as millions in the congested strip have been displaced by strikes and bombings. On the other hand, the Israeli military claimed that aircraft killed 3 Hamas members in Rafah, including 2 senior military operatives. Meanwhile, Palestinian police said that at least 5 officers were killed in Israeli airstrikes on the southern city. Israeli military has also claimed to have discovered a tunnel network hundreds of meters long and running partly under UNRWA's Gaza headquarters. They have called it new evidence of Hamas's exploitation of the main relief agency for Palestinians. In a statement, UNRWA said that it had vacated the headquarters on October 12th, that is 5 days after the war began, and was therefore unable to confirm or otherwise comment on the Israeli finding. Now, this comes as cross-border strikes are also continuing In the latest, Israeli fighter jets struck 3 Hezbollah military command centers in southern Lebanon. The military's aircraft and artillery also struck additional Hezbollah locations across the Lebanese-Israeli border. At that time, Iran's foreign minister was in the country to meet with the Hezbollah leader and discuss the powerful paramilitary group's ongoing clashes with the Israeli forces. Iran's top diplomat has now warned that a full-blown attack on Lebanon would rather spell the end of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Any move by the Zionist regime for a large-scale attack on Lebanon will spell the end of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the end of the current situation in the region.
Furthermore, Iranian Foreign Minister Ahmed Abdullahian has said that Iran and the US have exchanged messages throughout Israel's 4-month-old war on Hamas in Gaza, including about Lebanese armed group Hezbollah. And for more on this, we're now being joined by Alan Boosteen, joining us live from California. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California. Thank you very much for taking our time and joining us here on WION.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Hi. So according to UNRWA, there are 1.4 million displaced people in Gaza. The IDF has now asked them to evacuate yet again. Now, the Israeli airstrike has already killed 44 Palestinians. Mr. Boosteen, talk to us about the options that are on the table for the Palestinians. The pertinent question being, where can they go from Rafah?
So the IDF has stated to the Israeli political regime that that's up to the Israeli political establishment to decide. Netanyahu ordered the IDF to plan its operation in Rafah. The IDF has been planning its operation in Rafah for several weeks now, so they didn't really need this order. In turn, the chief of staff today told Netanyahu, that's all well and good, but you need to tell us what do you want done with those 1.3, 1.4 million Palestinians. There's been different ideas that were raised within the IDF, possibly to allow them to evacuate back up to the northern parts of the Gaza Strip where they were all evacuated from, possibly to allow them to return to Khan Yunis. Both of those are major operations. The IDF controls the large parts of the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. It is also largely in rebels. The Khan Yunis is ongoing fighting. So the idea that these 1.4 million Palestinians will just move from here to there is not realistic. It's going to take a lot of time, and I don't think the IDF is going to be able to do it as quickly as Netanyahu and the political establishment really wants.
Absolutely, Mr. Boosteen. We've seen that the evacuation of northern strip of the Gaza, the northern area of the Gaza Strip, led to a lot of casualties, civilian casualties. And meanwhile, Egypt has warned that any movement of Palestinians into Egypt would threaten the 4-decade-old peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. Meanwhile, aid agencies have also warned that large number of civilians could die in the offensive. Talk to us about the humanitarian repercussions of Israel's offensive in Rafah.
So the Palestinian civilians in Rafah in the past was home to around about 200,000 Palestinians. Right now it's home to 1.3, 1.4 million Palestinians who are refugees sleeping in the streets, mostly in the city of Rafah, and there's also another roughly 400,000 in the refugee camps in El-Mawasi above that. They have nowhere to go. As you stated, Egypt is closing its borders. It's also said that it's even going to lay down landmines in order to make sure that Palestinians cannot get over the border to there. Right. Aid agencies are all saying they have no infrastructure anywhere else in the Gaza Strip. Now, right now, because of what's happening with UNRWA, it is possible that the IDF is going to develop its own plans to distribute aid by itself. The Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, said that he's working on a plan in order to let the IDF distribute aid up north, the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, bypassing UNRWA and the aid agencies. Possibly, the IDF may try to do this down south in Khan Yunis as well. But there really is, right now, no humanitarian infrastructure for UNRWA or aid agencies anywhere other than Rafah, because these have been destroyed in the war, some of them by Hamas, most of them by the IDF. But right now, there's just no real infrastructure for anywhere for them to go, which is why Netanyahu ordered the IDF to make sure that the plan in Rafah is done by when Ramadan starts. That is around March 10th, March 11th. I'll be very surprised if that actually happens.
Mr. Boosteen, the international community, including the US and Germany, they are Israel's allies, they both have publicly opposed IDF's offensive and warned Israel of disaster if it launches invasion of Rafah. Do you think that will deter Netanyahu from going forward with its offensive plans in Rafah?
Well, it's very important to put Netanyahu's statements in context. Right now, the ongoing hostage negotiations are completely stalled. It looked like they were advancing very far. Israel was negotiating with Qatar, Egypt, and the United States in Paris 2 weeks ago. They came up with a deal they agreed upon. Hamas gave an answer that was completely unacceptable to Israel. Israel, in turn, said it's not even going to go into negotiations with Hamas. It is boycotting the negotiations in Egypt and said that instead it is going to apply more military pressure on Hamas in order to have Hamas give back a better option, a better deal. And really, that is what is underscoring, I believe, why Netanyahu is making these public statements. Because like I said, he ordered the IDF to plan this operation. The operation has been planned by the IDF for a month. Netanyahu does not need to order that publicly. The fact that he's doing that is sort of a way to say we're prepared to go forward. I think he's hoping that Qatar and Egypt will pressure Hamas to say, bring us back a different answer so we can negotiate. So it's very possible this is all a tactic, and maybe Germany's pressure and the United States' pressure and the EU's pressure will also help in Israel using more rhetoric, but not actually launching a full-scale offensive. But really, it's right now up to Hamas. If they give back a better option to Israel, they could probably hold off this invasion because hostage negotiations will go forward. Otherwise, Israel will probably push forward to just try to pressure Hamas more and more.
Well, Mr. Boosteen, thanks very much for taking our time and joining us here on WION.
Thank you. Have a good day.
In Israel-Hamas war, as the Israeli strikes continue to pound the Gaza Strip and Hamas's ally Hezbollah and Lebanon. Tel Aviv's offensive against the Palestinian militant outfit has also drawn harsh criticism. In the latest, EU's foreign policy chief Josep Borrell has said that Israel's plans for a military offensive on Rafah in the Gaza Strip is quote-unquote alarming. First, let's take a look at war-torn Gaza, where a man has been injured in the Israeli strike, according to Palestine Red Crescent Society. The video shared by the Palestinian relief group shows a wounded Gazan being pulled out of the debris. The armed strikes in Rafah city come at a time when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the Israeli armed forces to prepare a plan and evacuate Rafah civilians. Netanyahu has ordered officials to present a combined plan for evacuation and destruction of Hamas's militants hidden in the city. Shifting focus to Israel's neighbor in the north, Lebanon, where the Israeli armed forces launched strikes in southern Lebanon's El Qiyam, wounding a Hezbollah commander. Responding to Israel, the Iran-backed Lebanese militant outfit also fired dozens of rockets into the Israeli territory. At the same time, Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian has vowed to support the Hezbollah during his visit to Lebanese capital Beirut. Looking at the backlash and public outcry, Tel Aviv's actions against the civilians of Gaza is being criticized and slammed. In West Bank's Jericho, dozens of Israeli and Palestinian activists staged protests with placards saying, "End the war and occupation." Later, the protesters were dispersed by the Israeli security personnel deployed at the protest site.
We came today to organize a joint Palestinian and Israeli demonstration against the war and genocide in Gaza. Our demands are an immediate ceasefire, an end to the war, an all-for-all swap deal, and just a political solution to the Palestinian issue.
In Yemen's Sana'a, thousands of Houthi militias took to the streets and showed solidarity, chanting slogans for Palestinians suffering in the Gaza Strip. The protesting Houthi rebels also carried a large-sized Palestinian flag in Sana'a. In Gaza, the hospitals and medical supplies have been worst affected, and patients, particularly the children, have been bearing the maximum brunt of armed conflict.
Ahead of a looming ground offensive in the southern Gaza city of Rafah, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu directed his military to prepare to evacuate an estimated 1.3 million people in the city. And this comes as Israel is continuing with its offensive in the Gaza Strip. Israeli airstrikes have killed 17 people in Rafah on the Gaza border overnight, and at least 117 people have been killed and more than 150 injured in last 24 hours in Gaza. The health ministry in Gaza reports that the total death toll from the Israeli offensive now stands at over 28,000 people killed and almost 68,000 injured. And this as millions in the congested strip have been displaced by strikes and bombings. On the other hand, the Israeli military claimed that aircraft killed 3 Hamas members in Rafah, including 2 senior military operatives. Meanwhile, Palestinian police said that at least 5 officers were killed in Israeli airstrikes on the southern city. Israeli military has also claimed to have discovered a tunnel network hundreds of meters long and running partly under UNRWA's Gaza headquarters. They've called it new evidence of Hamas exploitation of the main relief agency for Palestinians. In a statement, UNRWA said that it had vacated the headquarters on October 12th, 5 days after the war began, and was therefore unable to confirm or otherwise comment on the Israeli finding. Now, this comes as cross-border strikes are also continuing, as in the latest. Israeli fighter jets struck 3 Hezbollah military command centers in southern Lebanon. Now, the military's aircraft and artillery also struck additional Hezbollah locations across the Lebanese-Israeli border. And at that time, Iran's foreign minister was in the country to meet with Hezbollah's leader and discuss the powerful paramilitary group's ongoing clashes with Israeli forces. Iran's top diplomat has now warned that a full-blown attack on Lebanon would spell the end of Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu.
Any move by the Zionist regime for a large-scale attack on Lebanon will spill the end of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the end of the current situation in the region.
Furthermore, Iranian Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian said that Iran and the United States have exchanged messages throughout Israel's 4-month-old war on Hamas in Gaza, including about Lebanese armed group Hezbollah.
Well, there is anger on the streets of Israel as frustrated demonstrators call on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to do more to get the hostages out of Gaza. In Israel, Tel Aviv and nearby towns were rocked by massive demonstrations where people in thousands hit the streets. They voiced their demands of fresh deal for hostage release and Netanyahu's ouster from the office.
על איזו אחדות אתם מעזים לדבר? אם אין שיח על עמק השווה. צבא העם. המושג הזה נכבד
A separate demonstration by hundreds of Israelis was staged against the government at Tel Aviv's Habima Square and outside the Israeli Defense Ministry compound. The demonstrators also sang the national anthem at the Habima Square.
Came here tonight to keep fighting for the release of my brother and the rest of 135 hostages. Like every Saturday, like every day, we want them back. My brother has a 2-year-old son who lost his mother and is waiting for a hug from his father for 127 days.
Most of us here at Hostage Square just want a hostage deal. We want our people to come home. We feel that no price is too high.
Meanwhile, in the Israeli town of Qasera, hundreds of demonstrators marched towards Prime Minister Netanyahu's private residence. They shouted slogans calling for Netanyahu's resignation. Some also carried a banner that read, "The war-ridden region of West Asia contends with a combination of oil production cuts and the lingering impact of the Israel-Gaza war."
Now, Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, issued warnings about the region's growth prospects, emphasizing the need for reform in energy subsidies. The fund, it's revised its GDP growth forecast for West Asia and North Africa down to 2.9% this year.
Well, Georgieva also highlighted the recent flare-up in violence, disrupting regional tourism and trade, particularly impacting neighboring economies like Egypt and Jordan. The IMF emphasizes the need for reform in West Asia, particularly in energy subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies currently make up 19% of the GDP in the region.
According to Georgieva, phasing out these subsidies could lead to savings of $336 billion. That's equivalent to the economies of Iraq and Libya combined. Additionally, there's a growing recognition of the importance of technology investment, particularly in AI, to bolster the region's resilience and competitiveness in the face of global economic shifts. And despite these challenges, the IMF upgraded the global economic outlook after citing faster than expected easing of inflation. Challenges, however, do remain.
Attacks in the Red Sea have increased freight costs globally. The Houthis targeting commercial vessels have further exacerbated the situation. All this dents the growth prospects of several economies still recovering from previous shocks.
Iran has been at the center of the raging conflict in West Asia today. While marking its 45th anniversary of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran once again invoked Israel. Israeli Prime Minister has brushed off mounting criticism against his plans to enter the largest city of southern Gaza. There seems to be a growing rift between US and Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister says that he has not spoken to US counterpart after Joe Biden termed Israel's response to Hamas as over the top. Egypt, which is one of the key mediators between Hamas and Israeli authorities, has conveyed a message to Hamas. Without a hostage deal in place, Hamas has 2 weeks until Israel begins its offensive in Rafah. The Israeli Prime Minister has slammed his critics, claiming that telling Israel to not enter Rafah is equivalent to Israel losing its war against Hamas. Benjamin Netanyahu has given a deadline to Israeli forces so that it comes up with an evacuation plan for the densely populated city of Rafah. Rafah is located on the Egyptian border, and normally it's home to about 280,000 people. Those numbers have swelled to roughly 1.5 million people. That's well over half of Gaza's entire population. And many, if not most, of these people are now living in sprawling tents that have dotted up the city. It is unclear to where such a large number of people could safely be moved. Israel says that Rafah, which borders Egypt, is the last remaining stronghold for the Hamas militant group in Gaza. Over 1 million displaced Palestinians are living in makeshift tents. The conditions are already miserable there, and now there is panic and fear on the ground. People are looking to the other side of the border for help, escaping the violence in parts of the Gaza, including Jabalia, West Bank and Han Yunis. A huge population moved to south of the Gaza Strip early last year. Israeli military threw pamphlets telling people to flee the northern region as they continue the operation against Hamas. And now that the majority of the population has moved to the south, they have nowhere left to go. Now, according to an Egyptian official, under no circumstances would fleeing Palestinians be allowed to cross the border into the Sinai Peninsula, and that any attempt to relocate them to Egyptian soil would collapse the peace deal between Egypt and Israel. Moreover, Egypt has sent about 40 tanks and armored personnel carriers to northeastern Sinai to prepare for the offensive. The latest operation has prompted concerns from foreign governments. UK Foreign Minister David Cameron wrote on social media platform X, and I quote, "Deeply concerned about the prospect of a military offensive in Rafah. Over half of Gaza population is currently sheltering in that area. The priority must be an immediate pause in the fighting to get aid in and hostages out, then progress towards a sustainable permanent ceasefire." The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said that Israeli offensive on Rafah would lead to unspeakable humanitarian catastrophe and grave tensions with Egypt, while Saudi Arabia has warned of the extremely dangerous repercussions of storming and even targeting Rafah.
Let's shift our focus now. A series of Israeli airstrikes on the southern Gaza town of Rafah killed at least 52 people. As per Gaza officials, the strikes hit 14 houses and 3 mosques in different parts of Rafah. Mediators held talks in Cairo for a pause in the fighting and the release of around 130 hostages Israel says are still in Gaza, including 29 thought to be dead. Hamas seized over